Thank you, Greg, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce you to Pantherics Incorporated. As Greg mentioned, the company was formed a couple of years ago, almost to the date, to develop innovative new drug solutions to treat inflammatory diseases of smooth muscle. The enabling technology that we worked at UWM involves the modulation of GABAA receptors in peripheral tissues. And so that's a lot. Now, hopefully, I'll be able to explain that in 7 minutes. So what I'd like to do is to describe this fundamentally novel platform technology and our clinical lead drug that we've designed and tested that we're positioning for asthma and other respiratory conditions. So first, what are inflammatory diseases of smooth muscle? There are several, and the figures on the right can show the diversity of the problem. So we can see this in diseases of the lung, in the gastrointestinal tract, in the bladder. And in all of these conditions, underlying inflammation leads to unwanted contraction of muscle. So think in asthma, constriction of the airway that makes it difficult to breathe. In the gastrointestinal tract, an inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome, there's unwanted contraction that can cause cramps and diarrheal symptoms. In an overactive bladder, there's urinary urgency, which is caused again by inflammation, causing the smooth muscle of the bladder to contract. Current therapies for this range of conditions is really pretty limited and usually involves anti-inflammatory drugs and muscle relaxants. These are often not very effective in many disease conditions, certainly in asthma. The disease becomes tolerant to the drugs or resistant to the drugs, and in the case of steroids, there are many adverse effects that are common. The Pantherics solution is to employ a novel mechanism of action, novel mechanism of drug action, where a single small molecule drug that can be taken orally can do two things: reduce the underlying inflammation, and relax the smooth muscle contraction. Now, GABA receptors. So what are GABA receptors? These are well-known drug targets for drugs that work within the central nervous system, within the brain. So we can think of drugs that are commonly used to treat seizures or anxiety, interact with the GABA receptor. And some of these drugs have been on the market for 50 years or so. Our group was part of a number of teams that have actually discovered that GABA receptors are also found in tissues outside of the brain. And so this creates really interesting opportunities. We're the first company to develop specific drugs that target GABA receptors, GABAA receptors, in peripheral tissues, that is outside of the central nervous system, and they do not cause any central nervous system effects or toxicities. So in a broad sense, our drug discovery platform repurposes decades worth of knowledge on modulating GABAA receptors for drugs that work within the central nervous system, now for conditions outside. The GABA receptor is a validated drug target, which means we understand quite clearly the biological and biochemical effects of this receptor, and also the pharmacological effects of drugs that interact with this receptor. So there are a number of aspects of this technology where we're not starting from a dead stop, but we're really taking advantage of many decades of drug knowledge that we're now applying to a new problem. So based on our platform technology, we developed a compound that we named PI-301 to control asthma symptoms by modulating GABAA receptors in the lung. And so we have shown extensively in animal models, and there are several animal models of asthma, that our drug can do the two things we want it to reduce inflammation and reduce bronchospasm. So in this model, we show that the drug PI-301 interacts with the GABA receptor, and in this model opens the airway that's closed due to the inflammation-induced muscle constriction. So we've also shown that our drug form can be taken orally, therefore avoiding the use of inhalers that are quite often used in asthma as a first-line control, and for many patients are used inappropriately or incorrectly. We've shown that there are no toxicities or systemic immune effects, which is really quite distinct from steroids, which are commonly used in asthma that do cause systemic immune suppression and other untoward effects. We've published this extensively in the scientific literature and have shown again in many animal models that the drug effects are as expected. Asthma is a global healthcare problem. It's been estimated that 334 million individuals suffer from asthma worldwide, affecting about 14% of the world's population. In the U.S., asthma is also a rather significant problem. The economic burden in 2013 was estimated at over $81 billion. And the prescription drug costs are also rather staggering. If we understand estimates of about 15 million individuals being treated annually, each paying about $1,800, that translates into a $25 billion plus therapeutic market for asthma treatment. Just as a benchmark for a new drug, Merck's drug Singulair recorded annual sales of over $4 billion prior to its patent expiration. So we can see the value placed on innovative new asthma compounds, asthma drugs. So our asthma approach addresses a real unmet need in asthma treatment. And although there are drugs available, let's look at a few examples, I think, that accentuate the problem. First, a large clinical study was published, actually just this past summer, reported that a majority of patients with mild disease had no significant difference in their response to two leading medications compared to placebo. No significant difference compared to placebo. In more severe disease, in moderate to severe asthma, over half, 55% of patients reported that their asthma symptoms are not under control, and these patients had access to health care and pharmaceuticals. Third, in the more severe disease situation, where patients require biologic therapies, it was reported that the injectable biologics costing $30,000 or so exceed any measures of cost effectiveness. So if we take all of these together, we really see that an oral controller medication based on a non-steroidal mechanism of action would address these treatment needs across the spectrum of asthma disease. Pantherics has generated solid traction in moving its business forward. Our research in the academic labs has been supported by several NIH grants to both UWM and our collaborator at Columbia University. UWM has filed patents based on our inventions, and the company has exclusive rights to these patents, which we are prosecuting in collaboration in key markets globally. We have secured funds to support company activities while we're getting things going. We received an NIH STTR grant, phase 1 grant. We have a phase 2 in process. We've developed some investor funds, as well as a product development partnership with a well-known preclinical and clinical contract research organization to help us get going along the pathway of planning the preclinical and clinical studies, the regulatory strategy, and logistics. And this is all supporting the company during our Series A financing effort. Certainly the strength of Pantherics is our leadership team. I won't go through everyone's name, but the team brings a very high-level experience in the life science industry, whether in finance, in research, and operations. We formed numerous life science companies and taken several of them public. To wrap up, we're doing a Series A financing to support a 3-year development timeline. Proceeds would support phase 1 and preclinical studies for oral and nebulized form of PI301. And within the 3-year time frame that we'd like to fund, we'd like to advance 301 into 3 phase 2 clinical trials for asthma control, asthma acute exacerbation, and COPD. At this point, I would be happy to answer questions. Also, please, afterwards, contact Lauren Peterson, who's also in the audience, who is our Chief Financial Officer and can help explain the company. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I have a quick question for you, because you're the furthest along. You decided to take your technology out as a startup. Yeah. We have 5 other presentations before you that are all contemplating maybe a startup, maybe licensing to industry. Why did you decide to do a startup versus licensing to big pharma?
Maybe I can answer that in a couple of ways. In the pharma space, at any rate, the customer for your technology, big pharma industry, very much wants to de-risk and see technologies that at least have some human clinical experience. That's that valley of death that we always talk about in the pharma world, between what we can fund in academia and what happens in big pharma. And so, startup venture is really the way to do that, to raise the amount of funds so that we can do the formal preclinical studies, the GMP manufacturing, and at least get a phase 1 1B type of study. So, I think it's just more practical for us to do it because our customer's not ready. The other side of that is I think we're in an environment in Milwaukee that's very conducive to starting a new company. We've been funded very early on through our research foundation. There's a lot of support for patenting very early on. And so within that environment, I think it was kind of natural for us to go ahead and start the company.
Awesome. Thank you. Very good. Any other questions for Doug?
Have you identified any potential side effects?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, are there any side effects, I suppose, with our lead compound? We haven't seen any. So we've done acute dosing studies. So it's a typical ICH 28-day repeat, aggressive dosing study. We haven't seen any. And so we've also done a repeat dose immunotoxicology study. So one of the things we want to observe is our drug distinct from current immunosuppressive drugs? While they may treat asthma, they're doing a lot of other things. And so we also saw no immune suppression. There were various ways that we could measure that. So the drug seems relatively selective for the disease, and even at very high doses, we're not seeing immune tox. And also, I just mentioned that the core structure of the compound that we use has been used clinically for 50 years. And so these are biochemically and physiologically very safe compounds. Clearly, they work in the central nervous system, so you get some CNS effects, but our drugs don't get into the CNS, so we don't see any of that.
All right. Thanks a lot, Doug.
Thank you.